The fence post does not move. It stands alone in the middle of a Kansas field, surrounded by nothing but cracked dirt and dry wind. No barn nearby. No farmhouse. Just that post, jutting from the earth like a dark finger pointed at the sky. Darnell Whitfield stops his pickup truck on the gravel road. He kills the engine. He stares. He has driven this stretch of Route 56 for 11 years, hauling grain, hauling cattle feed, hauling everything a working farm demands. He has watched steel fences rust through. He has watched treated lumber posts split and soften and lean like tired old men. But this post, this dark, dense, almost black post standing in a field that clearly hasn't been farmed in decades, it doesn't lean. It doesn't crack. It just stands there, solid as the day it was set. Welcome back to Earth, Lost Vault and Secret. If this is your first time here, this channel is dedicated to revealing the secret truth of ancient agricultural practices that the system has spent billions to hide from the earth. Feel relaxed, hit that subscription button, and turn on your notifications because we drop this type of content every week. Make sure you watch this with your family and friends. If you are a returning friend, thank you for always making your time here. Your dedication has taken us this far, and we must say we love you especially. Let's now go back to what we have today. Darnell climbs out of the truck. The August heat hits him like a wall. He walks across the dry grass, gravel crunching under his boots, until he reaches the post and wraps both hands around it. He pulls. Nothing. He rocks it side to side. Nothing. He crouches and examines the base where wood meets soil. No soft rot. No insect damage. No crumbling edges. The wood is dense and tight-grained, the color of deep mahogany, and it smells faintly of something sharp and clean, like oil from inside the earth itself. Darnell stands up straight and looks down the field. There are more posts. A long line of them stretching toward the tree line, connected by nothing now, whatever wire or wood they once held long since rusted and fallen away. But the posts remain, standing in perfect formation like soldiers who never got the order to leave. He takes out his pocket knife and drags the blade across the surface. The knife skips. He presses harder. The blade barely marks the wood. Darnell is a man who works with his hands. He knows wood. He knows the difference between pine and oak, between cedar and poplar. He has split enough logs to fill 3 barns. But whatever this is, it is not anything he has driven a nail into before. He looks up at the lone Osage orange tree standing at the edge of the field. Twisted trunk. Low, thick branches. Ugly, knobby, green fruit hanging like something the earth made on a bad day. Nobody around here plants that tree anymore. Most people try to get rid of it. And that is exactly the question that will keep Darnell Whitfield up past midnight for the next 3 weeks. Hi viewers, have you ever driven past an old fence post or an old tree and just known there was a story behind it that nobody bothered to tell you? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I want to know where you are watching from. Because this story isn't really about wood. It never was. A tree this strong. This durable. This is perfectly built for the American prairie. And the entire country walked away from it. That doesn't happen by accident. That post in Darnell's hands is over 100 years old. It is harder than most materials used in modern construction. It has outlasted 3 generations of the family that planted it. It has outlasted the farm itself. And the secret of why America buried this tree, why government bulletins turned against it, why millions of them were cleared from farmland in a single generation, that secret did not begin on the Kansas prairie. It began with a nation whose name most history books mention only once, if at all. And what that nation knew about this tree changed the balance of power across an entire continent. Long before any settler ever dragged a plow across the Great Plains, A man named Crow Feather stood at the edge of the Neosho River and bent a branch without breaking it. He was not testing the branch. He was reading it. His hands moved slowly, pressing the wood into a curve that would have snapped pine, that would have splintered oak. But this wood held. It bent like something alive, like it understood what was being asked of it, and then it pushed back. Not breaking. Not yielding. Pushing. Crow Feather was Osage. And the Osage people had known for generations what that push meant. It meant power. The tree they called the bowwood, what settlers would later call Osage orange, grew in a small, specific region. Parts of what are now Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. A narrow range. A contained secret. The Osage guarded the location of the best stands carefully, the way a man guards a well in drought country. Because whoever controlled this would control the most lethal bows on the continent. A bow carved from Osage orange could launch an arrow with a force that bows made from other wood simply could not match. The density of the wood stores energy the way a spring stores pressure. Pull it back, and it coiled. Release it, and it exploded forward with a snap that sent arrows through distances that seemed impossible. Neighboring tribes knew it. They wanted it. Badly. French traders moving through the region in the early 1700s documented something that stopped them cold. They wrote it in their journals because they could not believe it without writing it down. One single Osage bow could be traded for a full horse and saddle. A horse. Not a few pelts. Not a bundle of cloth. A horse, the most valuable commodity on the frontier. One bow. One horse. That exchange tells a story that has nothing to do with sentiment, and everything to do with military economics. The Osage people understood what they had. They built a quiet, powerful economy around it. They traded selectively. They moved deliberately. They did not give the wood away. Kezia Morningcloud, a historian whose research into Osage trade routes would reshape how scholars understood pre-colonial commerce, once described it this way: the Osage didn't just find a useful tree. They found leverage. And they held it. But even the Osage could not predict what would happen when desperate, land-hungry settlers arrived on the treeless plains and discovered the tree for an entirely different reason. The bow had been the first secret. The second secret was something no weapon could match. Something that would spread across millions of acres of American farmland and quietly hold the frontier together. And it began not with warriors or traders. It began with a problem so basic, so brutal, that settlers were willing to try anything to solve it. The cattle came through Marcus Ellington's corn on a Tuesday in September 1863, and by Wednesday morning, there was nothing left. Not a stalk. Not a cob. Not a single leaf is still standing. Marcus stood at the edge of what had been 3 acres of late-season corn, his boots sinking into torn soil, and felt the kind of anger that doesn't make a man loud. It makes him very quiet. It makes him stare at the ruined ground and do arithmetic in his head. How many weeks of food, how many dollars, how many months of work, and come up with a number he cannot afford. The Great Plains in the mid-1800s did not care about a farmer's math. The land was vast. Impossibly, brutally vast. Skies so wide they seemed to press down on a man's shoulders. Wind that never fully stopped, just changed direction. And trees, almost none. The great interior of North America, stretching from Kansas to Nebraska to the Oklahoma Territory, was a landscape of grass and sky and almost nothing else. No timber. No natural barriers. No way to draw a line in the earth and make it mean something. And without fences, nothing meant anything. Property lines were just words on paper. A man could claim a quarter section of land, plant it, water it, tend it through a brutal summer, and lose everything in a single night to cattle that wandered freely because there was nothing to stop them. Courts were distant. Sheriffs were rarer. The only law that worked was a fence. But to build a fence, you needed wood. And wood was the one thing the prairie refused to provide. Marcus had already tried importing lumber. The cost was ruinous. He had tried stacking stones, but the topsoil was too shallow, the rocks too scattered. He had tried a thick rope stake between iron posts, and the cattle leaned against it until it gave. He was not alone. Across the entire Midwest, thousands of farmers faced the same brutal equation: no trees, no fences, no fences, no farming, no farming, no future. Then a neighbor, a stubborn old man named Silas, who talked too much and was usually right, pointed at a line of twisted, ugly trees growing along a creek bed 3 miles east. "Plant those," Silas said. Marcus looked at the trees. They were not pretty. Gnarled branches. Long, sharp thorns. Strange green fruit the size of a man's fist, bumpy and bright, hanging like something out of a fever dream. "Plant those?" Marcus said. "Close together," Silas said. 1 foot apart. Then wait. Marcus did not trust Silas completely. But he was out of ideas, out of money, and a herd of someone else's cattle had just eaten his future. He planted the trees. And what grew from that decision would change the shape of American agriculture in ways that no one, not Marcus, not Silas, not the settlers spreading across the plains, could have imagined standing in that ruined cornfield. But the hedge that grew was only the beginning. The real miracle was still buried inside the wood itself, waiting for the day someone finally cut one of those trees down and looked at what was inside. By the spring of Marcus Ellington's 3rd year, a man on horseback could not push through his fence line. He tried. A neighbor's stallion, loose after a storm, ran straight at the hedge at full gallop and veered off 20 feet before impact, as if something in the animal's instincts recognized a wall it could not beat. The Osage orange hedge stood 8 feet tall now, dense as a rope braid. The branches interlocked like fingers, and every one of them carried thorns, long, hard, curved thorns that didn't bend or break, thorns that drew blood from a man who reached in carelessly and left deep, clean punctures in leather gloves. Marcus stood behind his fence line and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years on the Kansas prairie. Safe. The concept spreads the way fire spreads in dry grass. Fast. Unstoppable. By word of mouth across county lines, across state lines. Farmers who had been losing crops to wandering livestock for years watched Marcus's fields stay intact through an entire season, and they wanted what he had. Agricultural newspapers began writing about it. Extension workers started recommending it. In Illinois alone, agricultural surveys recorded over 60,000 miles of Osage orange hedge fences by the turn of the century. 60,000 miles. Stretch that straight, and it circles the earth twice. Farmers called the hedges by one phrase that spread as fast as the trees themselves: horse high, bull strong, and pig tight. That wasn't poetry. That was a performance guarantee. Every animal on a working farm, tested, measured, failed to break through. But the hedges did something more than fence. Cornelius Baines, a soil scientist working in Nebraska in the 1890s, started noticing something strange in fields bordered by Osage hedges. The soil near the tree lines held moisture longer after rainfall. The wind, that relentless plains wind that dried topsoil into dust and blew it east, slowed against the hedge walls. Birds nested inside the dense thorny branches and fertilized the soil beneath. Rabbits sheltered there. Foxes hunted the rabbits. A whole small ecosystem ran quietly along the fence lines while the farmer focused on the field inside. The hedges were alive in a way that no steel fence could ever be. In winter they became windbreaks that kept livestock from freezing in blizzards. In summer, their canopy shaded the soil at the field's edge and held the root zone cool. In autumn, the massive green fruits, those knobby, bright, alien-looking things, dropped to the ground and rolled through the fields, and farm children kicked them like balls while old farmers split them open and discovered that even the fruit had uses, pressing oil from the seeds for lanterns and leather treatment. Nothing about the tree was wasted. Everything about the tree was systematic. And yet, as Marcus would discover one afternoon when he finally took an axe to a mature Osage orange tree that had died at the edge of his property, the hedge was not actually the most remarkable thing about the tree. The most remarkable thing was what the axe told him the moment it struck. The impact ran back up through the handle and into his shoulders as he had swung against iron. Marcus pulled the axe free and looked at the blade. There was a notch in the steel. The wood had marked the axe. Not the other way around. He stood in the afternoon sun, staring at that notch, and the question that formed in his mind was the same question that would take another generation of farmers to fully understand. If the living tree was this strong, what happened to the wood when it dried? The fence posts that Darnell Whitfield pressed his hands against on that August morning in Kansas were not treated with anything. No chemical sealant. No pressure process. No linseed oil rubbed in by careful hands. They were cut from mature Osage orange trees in the late 1800s, sharpened at one end, and driven directly into the ground. And they are still there. Theodora Haynes, a wood scientist at a Midwestern agricultural university, ran a study in the early 2000s examining Osage orange fence posts that had been in continuous ground contact since the 1880s. She pulled posts out of the soil. She sliced them open. She ran them through compression tests, density analyses, and decay resistance evaluations. Her findings were simple and staggering. The posts showed almost no structural degradation. After 120 years buried in soil, exposed to freeze-thaw cycles, moisture, insects, microbial activity, all the forces that eat through wood, the Osage orange posts were still functionally sound. Still dense. Still hard. For comparison, pressure-treated pine, the modern standard for fence posts, has an expected lifespan of 20 to 40 years in ground contact. Cedar, which is considered durable, lasts 30 to 50 years under good conditions. Osage orange doesn't measure its lifespan in decades. It measures it in centuries. The reason lives inside the wood itself. Osage orange is laced with natural oils and chemical compounds, particularly a group of flavonoids, that actively resist the organisms that break wood down. Fungi cannot get a foothold. Termites avoid it. Water beads off the surface of a freshly cut post like it beads off wax. The wood is also among the densest hardwoods in North America. It sinks in water. Standard hardwood floats. Osage orange goes straight to the bottom. That density means the wood compresses under force instead of fracturing, which is why a steel axe blade notches before the wood gives way. Marcus Ellington's neighbors started cutting their mature hedge trees and setting posts across the entire county. Word spread from county to county. Posts from Osage orange required no replacement, no retreatment, no periodic inspection and rotation. A farmer could set his fence line once in his 30s and know his children would inherit it intact. That kind of permanence meant something on the frontier. It meant a farmer's labor compounded instead of decayed. It meant that what a man built with his hands had a chance of outlasting him. It meant independence, deep, structural independence, from the supply chains and hardware merchants and material costs that ate into a farm's margins year after year. Josephine Ellington, Marcus's daughter-in-law, a sharp-eyed woman who kept the farm's accounts in a leather ledger, noted in her journal in 1902 that the farm had spent nothing on fence materials in 11 years. Nothing. Not a dollar. Not a nail. That was not a small thing. That was a revolution. And revolutions have a way of making powerful people very uncomfortable. Because somewhere between Josephine's ledger and the sunrise of the 20th century, the story of the Osage orange began to change. Not the tree. The tree never changed. The story changed. And the people who changed it had something very specific to gain from making sure that America's farmers forgot what was standing in their own fields. The wire arrived in a box. That is how it started. Not with a speech. Not with a law. Not with any public announcement that the world was about to change. Just a wooden crate nailed shut, sitting on the loading dock of a farm supply store in Salina, Kansas, in the spring of 1874. Inside that crate was barbed wire. Reginald Tatum, the store owner, pried the lid open with a crowbar and pulled out a coil of the stuff. Twisted steel. Sharp barbs spaced every 4 inches. He turned it over in his hands and felt the points press into his palm through his work gloves. He sold every coil he had within 3 days. The speed of that sale told a story that had nothing to do with farmers and everything to do with what was coming for the Osage orange tree. Because barbed wire was not just a product. It was a system. And behind that system stood an industrial supply chain that needed farmers to keep buying things, and kept buying them forever. Follow the economics carefully. A farmer who planted Osage orange hedges in 1875 might not need new fencing materials until 1975. 100 years. 3 generations. 0 repeat purchases. That farmer was lost to the market the moment those trees took root. But a farmer who bought barbed wire, that farmer came back. Steel rusts. Posts rot. Staples work loose. Wire sags in heat and snaps in cold. The barbed wire fence was not a permanent solution. It was a maintenance contract dressed up as a product. Every 5 to 10 years, sections needed replacement. Every season brought small repairs. Every repair meant a purchase. Every purchase meant a sale. The mathematics of industrial agriculture had found its model. And the model required materials that failed on schedule. Osage orange did not fail on schedule. It did not fail at all. By the early 1900s, the same government extension programs that had once promoted hedge fencing began issuing new publications. The language shifted in ways that seemed reasonable on the surface but carried a different message underneath. Hedgerows were described as inefficient. Too wide. They took up space that could be planted. They were hard to maintain. They blocked mechanized equipment from turning at field edges. Agricultural bulletins began recommending removal. County agents visited farms and advised clearing. And here is the part that cuts deepest. None of those complaints were entirely false. Osage hedges did take up space. They were wide, sometimes 8 to 12 feet across a mature row. Mechanized plows did have trouble at hedge-bordered field edges. Everything the bulletins said was technically accurate. But they left something out. They never mentioned what would happen to the soil when the windbreaks disappeared. They never mentioned what farmers would spend on replacement fencing over the next 100 years. They never mentioned that the birds and the moisture retention and the erosion control were going away too. Delroy Simmons, a county farmer in central Oklahoma, kept every agricultural bulletin the government sent him from 1898 to 1931. His grandson found the collection in a trunk decades later and laid them out in order on a kitchen table. Reading them in sequence told a story that no single bulletin revealed on its own. In 1898, the Osage orange hedge was called a marvel of frontier ingenuity. By 1912, it was called an outdated method. By 1921, it was called an obstacle to modern farming. By 1931, chemical herbicides were being recommended for eradication. 33 years. 1 generation. A marvel became a weed. Delroy's grandson sat at that kitchen table for a long time after reading the last bulletin. Then he walked outside and looked at the one remaining hedgerow on the property. The one his great-grandfather had planted, the one nobody had gotten around to removing, and he pressed his hand against the wood. Still hard. Still standing. Still solid after 120 years. He went back inside and started making phone calls. Because the more he looked at what happened to this tree, the more he realized that the story of the Osage orange was not finished. It had simply been put on hold. And someone was about to wake it back up. The bulldozer reached the hedge line at 7 in the morning, and by noon, a fence that had stood since 1883 was gone. Laverne Pickens watched from the kitchen window of her farmhouse in Missouri as the machine pushed through the row of Osage orange trees her great-grandmother had planted by hand. She watched the roots come up out of the ground, thick, orange-streaked roots as dense and hard as the wood above, and she did not go outside. She just watched. The contractor that her bank had recommended called it land modernization. He said the old hedge rows were reducing her field efficiency by 12%. He said modern equipment needed clean, open field edges. He said she would recover the lost acreage and improve her yields. He said a lot of things. What he did not say, what nobody said in 1967 when Laverne signed the papers, was that within 4 years of removing those hedge rows, her topsoil loss to wind erosion would triple. That, without the windbreak, her winter wheat would suffer frost damage it had never suffered before. That the moisture her soil held through dry summers would drop, and her irrigation costs would climb to replace what the trees had provided for free. Nobody said any of that. Across the American Midwest in the decades following World War II, millions of miles of Osage orange hedge rows were removed from farmland. The process accelerated through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s as farm consolidation pushed fields larger, equipment grew bigger, and the industrial model of agriculture tightened its grip on how American land was managed. The removal was not quiet. It was loud and mechanical, and it smelled like diesel fuel and churned earth. But the replacement was quiet. Very quiet. Because what replaced the Osage orange hedge was not a better system. What replaced it was a purchase cycle. Steel posts. Barbed wire. Treated pine rails. Materials that gave agricultural suppliers a customer forever, because forever is exactly how long those materials needed replacing. Dr. Amara Lockett, a soil conservation researcher who spent 15 years studying farm records across Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, pulled together data in 2004 that painted a picture most agricultural economists did not want to look at directly. In counties where large-scale hedge removal had occurred between 1950 and 1975, topsoil loss rates in the following decade ran significantly higher than in counties where hedges had been preserved. Irrigation costs in cleared counties climbed faster. Fertilizer usage increased. Crop yields per acre, when adjusted for input costs, actually declined in many cases despite the expanded field sizes. The math that had justified clearing the hedges, more acreage, higher yields, turned out to be incomplete. It had counted the acres gained. It had not counted the soil lost. Laverne Pickens learned that lesson the hard way. By 1975, 8 years after the bulldozer came through, she was spending more on her farm than her great-grandmother had ever spent. More on erosion repair. More on irrigation. More on materials. More on everything. She walked the edge of the field one afternoon in late October, the wind cutting across the open ground with nothing to slow it, and she stopped where the hedge used to stand. The soil there was pale and thin. Blown out. The dark, rich topsoil that had built up along the hedge roots over 80 years was gone, taken east by wind that now had nothing to push against. She knelt and picked up a handful of what remained. It ran through her fingers like sand. Laverne Pickens never replanted the hedge. The cost and time required were beyond what her operation could absorb at that point. But she told the story to anyone who would listen, at county fairs, at church, at the grain elevator, and most people nodded and looked away, because the hedge was gone and there was nothing to do about it now. Except that across the country, quietly, in laboratories and university agriculture departments, a different kind of attention was being paid to what had been lost. And what those researchers were finding in the wood of the Osage orange tree was not what any of them had expected. Drive Highway K-177 south through the Flint Hills of Kansas on a clear morning, and the land tells a story without saying a word. The fields roll out wide and flat under a sky so big it seems to curve at the edges. Cattle graze in pastures fenced with modern steel posts and tight barbed wire. Farmhouses sit back from the road behind gravel drives. Everything looks like agriculture as it exists today, efficient, open, managed. But look at the tree lines. Along old property boundaries, following the path of creek beds and section lines that were drawn before any living person was born, the Osage orange trees still stand. Not in rows anymore. Not tended or managed. Just present. Twisted trunks and low heavy branches, their roots locked into ground that hasn't been plowed in a century. Darnell Whitfield drives this road now with different eyes than he had before he stopped at that fence post 3 years ago. He sees the ghost lines. That is what he calls them. The places where hedgerows used to run. You can still trace them by the lone trees left behind when the clearing crews came through. One tree every 100 yards or so. The survivors. The ones the bulldozers missed or couldn't reach or simply left because they weren't worth the fuel to remove. And beside those trees, in almost every case, the fence posts remain. Darnell has pulled 11 of them out of the ground over the past 2 years. Not randomly, he asked landowners, got permission, and documented everyone. He photographed them. He sent course samples to Theodora Haynes at the university. And every single post came back with the same result. Sound wood. Still structurally intact. Still dense. Still hard. The oldest post he recovered dated, by tree ring analysis, to approximately 1879. That post had been in the ground for over 140 years. It was cut from a tree that was probably 40 years old when it was harvested. A tree that had been growing when Abraham Lincoln was still alive. Darnell held that post across both arms in the back of his pickup and stood very still for a moment. He is not a sentimental man. He will tell you that plainly. He grew up on working farms, around working men, and sentiment doesn't pay for seed or fuel or equipment repairs. But standing there holding that post, he felt something that took him a few days to find the right word for. Grief. Not for the tree. For the decision. For the moment when someone looked at something that worked better than anything built to replace it, and decided it was in the way. He drove home that evening and sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything he knew about Osage orange. Every measurement. Every test result Theodora had sent him. Every historical record he had tracked down from county agricultural archives. He filled 12 pages. Then he sat back and looked at what he had written. The wood outlasts steel. It outlasts treated lumber. It outlasts concrete fence posts. It requires no chemical treatment, no maintenance, no replacement. It provides erosion control, wind protection, wildlife habitat, and moisture retention, all for free, all simultaneously, simply by being alive. A farmer who planted it in 1880 was still getting value from it in 1980. 100 years of return on a single planting. Darnell tapped his pen on the legal pad. Then he wrote one more line at the bottom of the page, underlined it twice, and stared at it for a long time. It read, "Why is nobody talking about this?" He did not know it yet, but the answer to that question was already being worked out in a laboratory 2 states away, and what researchers there had found inside the wood of the Osage orange tree was about to change the conversation entirely. The sample arrived at the materials laboratory in a brown paper bag with a handwritten label. Dr. Quincy Beaumont set it on his workbench, cut the tape with a box cutter, and pulled out a block of wood roughly the size of a hardback book. Dark. Dense. Almost black at the center, where the heartwood ran tight and close-grained. He set it on the scale first. The numbers surprised him. Not dramatically. He had read the historical accounts, he knew what Osage orange was supposed to be, but there is a difference between reading a number and feeling it. He picked the block up and set it down again just to confirm what his hands were telling him. Heavy. Significantly heavier than its size suggested. He ran it through compression testing. Then tensile strength. Then a standard Janka hardness evaluation, the test used to measure how much force it takes to press a steel ball halfway into a wood sample. White oak scores around 1,360 pounds on the Janka scale. Hard maple scores around 1,450. These are the woods used in hardwood flooring, in furniture, and in structural applications where durability matters. Osage orange scored 2,040. Dr. Beaumont wrote that number down and underlined it. Then he ran the decay resistance tests. He exposed samples to 3 species of wood-destroying fungi under controlled conditions, the same organisms that eat through lumber in contact with soil. He checked the samples at 30 days. At 60. At 90. The fungi did not gain a foothold. The wood resisted degradation at a rate that put it in a category occupied by only a handful of materials on Earth, most of them synthetic, engineered in facilities, produced through industrial chemical processes. The Osage orange did it with flavonoids. Natural chemical compounds that the tree produced on its own are built into the structure of every cell in the hardwood, requiring no factory, no energy input, no ongoing cost. Dr. Beaumont published his findings in a peer-reviewed materials journal in 2009. The paper was thorough, careful, and precise. It confirmed what frontier farmers had known by feel, what the notch in Marcus Ellington's axe blade had demonstrated in 1866, with the full weight of modern materials science behind it. The paper received modest attention in academic circles. Almost none outside them. That gap, between what the science showed and what the culture knew, is where Darnell Whitfield and a small, stubborn group of researchers, farmers, and conservationists began pushing in the years that followed. Beaumont connected with Theodora Haynes. Haynes connected with Dr. Amara Lockett. Lockett connected with Darnell. And Darnell, who had spent 3 years driving back roads and pulling fence posts out of Kansas soil, connected all of them to something the academics hadn't fully accounted for. The trees were still out there. Not just as individual survivors along old fence lines. In some counties, places where the clearing crews had never fully reached, where older farmers had resisted the modernization push, where terrain made bulldozing difficult, stretches of old Osage orange hedge remained intact. Living systems, still functioning, still holding soil, still sheltering birds, still producing the hardest wood in North America. In regenerative agriculture circles, interest was building fast. Farmers who had watched their topsoil decline decade after decade while their input costs climbed were asking a question that would have seemed absurd in 1967. What if we planted the hedges back? The economics were straightforward once someone actually ran them. A single Osage orange fence post, purchased if you could find one, costs more than a steel post up front. But a steel post lasted 20 years in the ground before corrosion required replacement. An Osage orange post lasted over 100 years. 5 steel posts versus 1 wood post over a century. The cost comparison was not close. And that was before counting the erosion control. Before counting the moisture retention. Before counting the wildlife habitat. Before counting everything the living tree provided that no steel post ever could. The math that had once justified clearing the hedges was being run again. This time, with all the numbers in. And what was emerging from those calculations pointed towards something that the industrial agricultural system had spent 100 years trying to avoid. A solution that paid for itself once. And then just kept working. Darnell Whitfield plants his first Osage orange tree on a cold morning in April, pressing the bare root seedling into the turned soil at the edge of his property line and packing the dirt firm with both hands. He is not romantic about it. He has run the numbers 3 times. He has read Beaumont's paper, Haynes's post-study, and Lockett's soil erosion data. He has walked his own fence line and counted the steel posts that are beginning to lean, the wire sections that need replacing, the soil at the wind-exposed corners of his fields that is thinner than it was 10 years ago. He has done the math. And the math brought him here, kneeling in cold April dirt, planting the first of what will eventually be 400 seedlings along 2 miles of his property boundary. He will not see the full hedge in his lifetime. The trees will take 15 years to reach mature height and density. His daughter will inherit the fence line when it is still growing. His grandchildren will be the first to cut posts from it. Darnell knows this. He plants the tree anyway. Because this is the thing that the industrial model of agriculture never found a way to commodify: the willingness to build something for people you will never meet, to invest in a return you will not live to collect, to trust that what you put into the ground will still be standing long after your name has faded from the deed. That philosophy did not go away when the hedges were cleared. It went quiet. It went underground, the way living roots go underground in winter. But it did not die. Look at what is happening across American agriculture right now. Regenerative farming is no longer a fringe conversation. It is showing up in university research programs, in USDA policy discussions, in the business plans of farmers who have watched input costs outpace margins for 20 years and decided that the industrial model is not as permanent as it seemed. Osage orange is showing up in those conversations too. Not loudly. Not yet. But it is there, in the research papers, in the regenerative agriculture forums, in the quiet decisions of farmers like Darnell who have run the numbers and reached the same conclusion that Marcus Ellington reached standing over a notched axe blade in 1866. This wood works. It works better than what replaced it. It works at a cost that drops to nearly zero once the tree is established. It works for 100 years without a single replacement purchase, without a single gallon of chemical treatment, without a single dollar paid back to a supply chain that profits from things breaking down. That is not a small thing. That is a radical thing. And radical things make people uncomfortable, especially people whose revenue depends on the problems that radical things solve. The Osage orange never failed. Let that land for a moment. This tree was not abandoned because it stopped working. It was not abandoned because something better came along. It was sidelined because it worked too completely, too permanently, too independently of the systems that needed farmers to stay dependent. A fence post that lasts 140 years is not a product. It is a problem for everyone except the farmer who sets it. Darnell stands up from the soil and brushes the dirt from his knees. He looks down the property line at the row of holes he has dug, waiting for seedlings. The wind comes across the open field and hits him square in the chest, cold and direct, with nothing to slow it. In 20 years, this wind will meet a wall. A living wall. 8 feet tall. Dense as rope. Full of birds and roots and the hardest wood in North America, growing quietly along the edge of his land, the way it grew along the edge of Marcus Ellington's land 150 years ago. The land remembers what we forget. It holds the record in its soil, and the old fence posts still standing after a century, and the ghost tree lines that trace property boundaries no living person drew, and the deep orange heartwood of every tree that refused to rot while the world around it changed and changed again. History does not always bury the truth. Sometimes it just waits. Patient. Rooted. Standing in a field at the edge of a gravel road, waiting for someone curious enough to stop, get out of their truck, and press both hands against something that should not still be standing, and discover that it is. If this story made you think differently about what we have lost, and what we still have time to reclaim, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every person who knows this story is one more person who might ask the right questions about what else we have been trusting. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about buried knowledge, forgotten solutions, and the quiet truths that survive long after the people who knew them are gone, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the notification bells so you never miss what comes next. There are more stories where this one came from. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what this story stirred up for you. Tell us what you think we have forgotten that is still worth finding. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needed to read today. The most dangerous invention in agriculture is something that never needs to be replaced. And the most powerful thing a person can do is remember that it exists.